It was all supposed to be so, well, inevitable. According to Francis Fukuyama, we were at the end of history. Liberal democracy had triumphed over authoritarian models in the battle of ideology. And while that didn't mean that every country was going to become a democracy necessarily, the struggle to establish a better system and a better way had nevertheless pretty much been finished. But now we stand in a period where democracy has been declining worldwide for a number of years in a row. Not only that, but some of the most apparently stable and solid democracies of the last century have been staring into the abyss and by no means clear about whether or not they're going to jump into it. So, are we in a period of democratic decline for real? And how bad could that actually get? That's what we're going to talk about in this video. There have been a few stories about this over the last week or two, largely because of a new report, the Global State of Democracy 2023, which has just been published by the International Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance, IDEA, in Sweden. They have a conceptual framework where they break up the different components of what makes an effective democracy, and it comes down to 4 areas. The first, representation. An elected government given power via credible elections, run on the principle of universal suffrage, free political parties, and all that leading to an effective parliament and also to local democracy. The second, rule of law. That's made up of judicial independence, the absence of corruption, predictable enforcement of the law, and something they call personal integrity and security. Last one isn't immediately and intuitively obvious as a component of democracy, although it certainly sounds like something you'd probably want in your society. We'll come back to that one. The third area is that of rights. Basic civil liberties, access to justice, and basic welfare. On the civil liberties side, you would include freedom of association and assembly, freedom of movement, freedom of the press, freedom of expression, and of course freedom of religion. On the access to justice side, you get political equality. They then added 2 areas that I think are redundant, but reflect perhaps the political context and mindset of the people who put the report together, which is gender equality and social group equality. Seems to me that those are rendered unnecessary within the umbrella of political equality. Full stop. You either have political equality or you don't. That's a sort of by the by de facto. Then the fourth area, participation. Electoral participation, civic engagement and civil society, all the various associations and NGOs and businesses that might expect to have their voices heard in the political process. They make a big point in this report about what they describe as the countervailing institutions, the set of governmental and non-governmental institutions that provide checks and balances to some degree to the misuse of political power. They are very focused on how such institutions retain their independence from governments, which is obviously quite important. They are less interested, from my reading, in how those are held to account. And this is one of the live debates right now, because of accusations of institutional capture by ideological viewpoints that push them away from their core purpose and the integrity with which it's meant to be carried out. If those institutions are so important to democracy, obviously that makes a big impact. The foreword to this report by Michael Ignatieff argues, for instance, that universities should be added to the list of countervailing institutions. The autonomy of those universities, he says, quote, is critical to the ability of their teaching staff to research what they want and teach what they believe their students need to learn. Right now, to the ears of some at least, That sounds too much like an open checkbook. While we could probably agree that political parties shouldn't be the ones, the question is who holds them to account if they stray from academic excellence in the name, for example, of ideology or indeed of religion, come to that. Because governments will want to interfere most if the system is broken in a way that nobody else is responsible for fixing. That said, personally, I think that this report's framework is reasonably well crafted, in that where there's a deterioration in any of those areas that it identifies, I think most would agree that that would represent a degradation in what we would hope for and what we would expect from a mature democracy. The International IDEA then rates all of the countries of the world according to their current status on that framework. And it's this, which I've been doing for a number of years, that produced those headlines of declining world democracy. More countries are going down the scale than are going up, notwithstanding the fact that some genuinely are actually going up. When you've seen the recent string of coups d'etat in Africa, for instance, that big picture message shouldn't really be that surprising. The main problem is just how hard it is for people who have a strong view of a type of politics to genuinely disentangle that view from an attempt to objectively rate the health of democracy. So, for instance, the report identifies both the United States and the United Kingdom as strong democracies, sure, but have nevertheless seen some recent decline. Now, not saying I would necessarily disagree with that as a starting point, but of course you immediately then become interested in the question, how do they, in this report, make that assessment? What are the factors they think are in play here? Well, let's start with America. Actually, we start and end with America because the report doesn't really say anything about why the UK might have declined. Kind of frustrating from my point of view. The first reference in the main body of the report to a problem in the US comes in reference to that category I said we would come back to: personal integrity and security. And it says this: people's experiences of democracy are affected by their basic security and whether they can safely go about their daily lives. And this is a problem in the US, they say, because of, quote, the significant rise in gun violence in the United States, where there were 646 mass shootings in 2022. This number is 86% more than 5 years ago in 2017, when the number was 348. I think most people would agree that is bad. You would validly ask, how can that be turned around? Is it specifically an indicator about the health of democracy? I'm not so sure. Do people not go out to vote because they think they might get mown down by the gunfire? No, I mean, at least not yet. It's the next one, though, that's the real tricky area. Having observed the rise of political polarization, the report praises to some extent the US system for how the US House Select Committee exercised oversight by investigating the January the 6th invasion of the Capitol building, and that it recommended that former President Trump should be charged with federal crimes. This, it implied, was evidence of effective oversight. This is where you get into grey areas. The idea that a political successor party, which is what dominated that committee, seeks the prosecution of the previous incumbent, and of course the lead candidate in the next election, remember? Well, the devil is in the detail, but that as a process is something that we see in demonstrably anti-democratic form in a number of countries. So, can observers like the International IDEA navigate those difficult grey areas without their own political preconceptions influencing their assessment? That's a difficult ask. Now, has Trump been involved in democratic decline in the US? Well, obviously, yes. simply and powerfully because of his refusal to accept the result of any election that goes against him. A lot of conservatives, like Ben Shapiro, who supported him during his presidency, have agreed with that. And Trump first signalled that mindset back in 2016, remember, but then had nothing more to say on the matter when it turned out unexpectedly that he'd actually won. And of course he has argued it since 2020, and that single act has been the cause of more decline in faith in the integrity of the system than just about anything else. Is he unique in moaning about the validity of results he doesn't like? Well, of course not. Hillary Clinton did it, Stacey Abrams did it, but moaning about it having de facto conceded is one thing. Rhetorically refusing to concede is one thing, but refusing to concede and trying to hold on to power or to change the result, that is another level altogether. Even the Cato Institute, hardly a nest of raving lefties, has drawn that distinction very clearly. And that's it. If he stopped doing that, and encouraged his supporters not to do that, one genuine threat to democracy goes away. Because none of it was about the things that Democrats hated about Trump, but that were fair game, like building the wall. Terrible, until Joe Biden decided maybe he needed to do something very similar, or suggesting COVID might have come from a lab leak. Terrible, until Trump was no longer there anymore, at which point scientists began to reflect, well, maybe they could consider it as a serious possibility again. This, of course, is the point. Trump derangement syndrome was real, rhetorically speaking. I mean, not that it was an actual medical condition, and not that everyone who intoned it about somebody else did so correctly. And that isn't about people who just politically hated what Trump did and what he stood for. Again, that is fair comment. Very divisive character. But standard political discourse was thrown out of the window, and not specifically just because Trump did that. The media told lies about him, misrepresented clumsy words as malevolent, and so on and so on. A lot of that deserved to be pushed back against and called out. But denying the result of an election, that is where it gets real, because democracy is fragile. And with 2024 coming, with Trump almost certain to have been indicted, even as he is the runaway preferred candidate, even as polls show him beating the unpopular incumbent, in the states that matter at least, it's shaping up to be the worst case scenario for democracy. So worst case scenario is this. Right now, people say they will vote Trump over Biden in the key swing states. And Trump believes that, obviously. Those people also say they're quite likely to change their mind if he is convicted. Now, that seems highly likely. Whether fairly or not, discuss. The election comes. Biden wins narrowly, say, because enough people were swayed by the fact that Trump was convicted. However, Trump only remembers that more people said they would vote for him, and so he goes big on the election fraud story once again. Right now, that is simply a description of all the known variables playing out in exactly the most obvious and likely way. Trump will be indicted. Abusing trial judges isn't a winning strategy, for one thing. Trump will be the candidate. Hard to see an alternative. The election will be close, seems to be the consistent story. Now the result, the actual result, is the closest variable. Maybe Trump can win it outright. Maybe Biden is that unpopular. His supporters will certainly believe so, which is the point. But if the polls are correct and the indictment makes a difference, then it's highly likely he just falls a little short, having expected to win. That is the nightmare scenario. Either party could head it off by nominating someone else. The polls suggest that any Democrat who is younger and able would beat Trump in the election. Likewise, any Republican other than Trump standing against Biden, Nikki Haley, Ron DeSantis, they would walk into the White House if they were nominated and they stood against Joe Biden. Against all expectations of the last 3 years, even Kamala Harris, usually seen as the drag on that ticket, would be successful against Trump, were Biden to step aside. Now, Nikki Haley versus Kamala Harris? I would probably call that for Haley, who seems to be the more effective campaigner. Gavin Newsom versus Ron DeSantis? I'd have called that for DeSantis a year ago, but now, probably Newsom. But the point is, either of those contests would be a delight, because neither of the participants would be likely to refuse to accept the result. Healthy democracies are those that can survive less than optimal leaders, because the institutions themselves are robust. But the real problem with American democracy isn't Trump per se. The US democratic decline is also about that ideological capture of institutions, the politicization of its legal system, basically the erosion of trust in just about everybody and everything. Various things that have and had nothing to do with Trump. Indeed, some of which may have been the thing that made the rise of a Trump-like figure all but inevitable. And yet those are not obviously captured by the International IDEA report, which makes me think that it hasn't fully gotten to grips yet with all the things that truly make democracies robust or make them fragile. And all of this matters, of course, because the growing fragility of our democracies are not happening in a vacuum. Because the end of history did not arrive, and we have China, and we have Russia championing to the world their authoritarian alternative to the democratic consensus. Chinese leader Xi Jinping has explicitly said his way, the authoritarian way, is the better way. There is still a battle of ideas around what should be the rules of the global world order within which we all live. And people seem rather confused about what they should support. Some Americans who strongly support individual liberty seem to be big fans of Putin, in spite of the total absence of that kind of liberty in Russia. And just the same, some people, those to be seen holding banners saying queers for Palestine, for one, they support people who would happily violently suppress them if they had been born in their country. It's the sort of thing that happens if you don't believe that there are consequences, that it's all just a game. That's the basic things we currently take for granted as so solid we can play that game however we want. That is the best indicator yet that we've forgotten the lessons of the past about the things you have to fight hard to protect. Let's hope we don't have to relearn those lessons the hard way.